By the winter of 1940, for the German officers in this quiet sector believed the war here had settled into predictability, a cold routine of watch posts, ration ledgers, and maps that never changed. They trusted the forested ridgelines, the narrow roads, and the weather itself, convinced these natural barriers tamed any American ambition. Reports describe the enemy as methodical and cautious, competent but unimaginative, unlikely to gamble armor where visibility collapsed and fuel froze. Confidence was not loud or boastful. It was administrative, stamped into paperwork, reinforced by silence, and made dangerous precisely because nothing seemed poised to disturb it. The Ardennes lay under a heavy gray lid, snow crusted and uneven, absorbing sound and warping distance. Pines stood close together, their branches sagging, their trunks forming blind corridors that swallowed movement. Villages were sparse and dark. Stone houses shuttered against wind and artillery both. Roads curved without warning, iced and narrow, forcing any vehicle into single-file obedience. For German planners, this terrain simplified defense. An attacker would be slow, exposed, and predictable. In their calculations, surprise belonged to them alone, held in reserve, waiting for orders that had not yet arrived from Berlin headquarters far away and silent. Across the line, American units filtered quietly into the region, men stiff from travel and uncertainty, boots crunching softly despite efforts at silence. They were not meant to attack here, only to hold, to learn the ground, to give exhausted divisions elsewhere a chance to breathe. Commanders spoke of rest and refit, of limited engagements, of a defensive posture that would ride out winter. Yet equipment still arrived, columns inching forward at night, radios murmuring with clipped voices. The war had a way of ignoring intentions, reshaping plans without asking permission, and imposing costs no briefing could fully explain itself. One tank was assigned to a crossroads village that barely registered on operational maps, a place of frozen mud and a church spire leaning slightly off-center. Its crew understood the posting as temporary, almost symbolic, a nod toward preparedness rather than expectation of contact. The vehicle idled more than it moved, engine coughing the cold, metal contracting with sharp ticks. Inside, breath fogged, gloves stiffened, the smell of oil mixed with sweat. They waited, watched, and tried not to imagine why they were there while snow drifted against armor plates and time slowed unevenly around them all. The German outpost nearby recorded nothing unusual. Patrols returned with numb fingers and routine reports. Listening posts heard only wind and the distant creak of trees. From their perspective, the Americans were exactly where doctrine predicted, thinly spread, defensive, cautious. The idea that armor might be committed aggressively here felt illogical. Fuel was precious, visibility poor, coordination difficult. War, they believed, rewarded prudence. Their confidence hardened not from arrogance, but from repetition, from months of uneventful nights that taught them what to expect and what to dismiss in cold ledgers and conversations conducted over weak coffee before dawn patrols returned. Within the American tank, the crew learned the village by heart. They memorized a bend in the road, the collapsed fence, the barn wall that could stop around or collapse under it. At night, they listened to the engine cool and the forest settle, every unfamiliar sound briefly charged with meaning. Letters were reread, jokes recycled, tempers kept carefully in check. Each man carried a private calculation of risk and responsibility, of survival balance against duty, shaped by training but sharpened by isolation and cold that seeped into bones and thoughts alike during long hours of waiting there quietly. Snow continued to fall, softening edges and dulling colors, until the world seemed reduced to grays and whites. Tracks filled quickly, erasing evidence of movement, reinforcing the illusion of stillness. Command radios crackled with routine acknowledgments, nothing urgent, nothing alarming. The Americans understood they were holding someone else's line, buying time with presence rather than action. It was an assignment defined by restraint. No one spoke of heroism. The expectation was endurance, measured in hours, vigilance, and the ability to remain awake while nothing happened under helmets rimed with frost and thoughts slowed by fatigue as dawns came and went. German confidence in the sector rested on assumptions shared across commands, reinforced by doctrine and experience earned elsewhere. The Americans had shown caution before, probing carefully, massing strength only where terrain favored them. Here the ground favored defense. Or so it seemed. Reports upward reflected calm, a sense that this was a place to conserve strength, not risk it. The weather itself felt like an ally. Snow, fog, and forest worked together to simplify the problem. Hold the line, watch the roads, and trust that nothing unexpected would emerge from the white silence during this long, static winter stretch here. For the tank crew, the larger strategic picture existed only in fragments, overheard briefings and second-hand rumors. Their world was immediate and tactile, defined by steel, frost, and a narrow arc of vision through periscopes. They cleaned weapons that might never fire, checked ammunition that might never be needed. Each task was performed with deliberate care, a ritual against boredom and anxiety. They sensed they were a small piece of something vast, yet isolated enough to feel forgotten. Responsibility pressed inward, heavy but quiet, like the snow piling unseen against the hull as watches stretched in breath-frozen air. The story of this sector began not with chaos, but with certainty, with German belief in a quiet front and an allied opponent they thought they understood. The village, the roads, the forest, and the weather all seemed to confirm that belief. An American unit settled into place without fanfare, fulfilling an assignment meant to be small. One tank stood watch where little was expected to happen, its role modest by design. The emotional register remained restrained, defined by expectation rather than drama. In that stillness, plans rested on assumptions, and the war waited unseen for someone to be wrong. The line no longer felt theoretical. It was not a mark on a map or a phrase in an orders briefing, but a physical pressure that settled into men holding it, heavy as wet wool. The Germans had shaped this ground with intention. Their doctrine favored depth and overlap. Fields of fire layered to punish movement, and every shallow rise or hedgerow had been measured not for beauty, but for killing efficiency. Machine gun nests were dug low, camouflaged with care, sighted to rake approaches rather than fire straight ahead. Mortar crews worked from memory, knowing distances by heart, having already broken earlier American probes that came in too confidently, too cleanly, as if training had prepared them for war without friction. Recent successes hardened those assumptions. German units here had watched American infantry hesitate under indirect fire, had seen radios fail, columns bunch on narrow roads, and junior officers freeze when orders dissolved into contradiction. Each engagement reinforced a belief that this enemy relied too heavily on machines and schedules. Cover that. Wait. The tank, once an asset among others, became the central pillar around which plans rotated. Without it, there was no credible way to contest German positions dominating the approaches. Inside the tank, the crew felt the constriction physically. Heat built as hatches stayed closed longer, the air thick with fumes. The engine vibration never stopped, a constant reminder that remaining still was itself an action, burning fuel, inviting detection. The gunner tracked hedgerows through limited optics, knowing that any flash might precede an impact. The loader worked by habit, hands finding shells in the dark, muscles aching from tension held to when those faltered. The men seemed unsure how to proceed. Defensive confidence grew not from arrogance but repetition, the steady proof of survival. Rifles were cleaned, belts were adjusted, and the line settled into itself, waiting. Across from them, nothing settled. The Americans felt the ground fight back against every step. Supply trucks arrived late, or not at all, choked by shell holes and traffic jams far behind the line. Ammunition types were mixed, rations irregular, and the maps in circulation disagreed with one another in small but dangerous ways. Platoons were stitched together from remnants of previous actions, unfamiliar voices shouting commands that carried no shared history. Radios crackled with partial messages, then died, forcing runners to move through exposed stretches already marked by German observation. Inexperienced pressed hardest in quiet moments. Men who had imagined combat as movement now found themselves waiting, listening to wind slide through bare branches and the distant cough of engines they could not see. Simple tasks took longer under stress. A squad repositioning to cover a ditch became an ordeal of whispered argument and misread hand signals. Each delay felt like an invitation to enemy fire. The strain of not knowing, of anticipating impact without release, drained more strength than the brief explosions that followed. Fragmented command made coordination brittle. Company plans narrowed with every failed attempt to maneuver. Objectives were reduced, then reduced again, until holding ground became the primary achievement. The presence of the tank reflected that contraction. It was not introduced as a spearhead or a symbol of dominance, but as a necessity to offset dwindling options. Its engine note was low and constant, a mechanical breathing that anchored the men around it. They did not cheer its arrival. They leaned into it, literally and mentally, as if proximity alone offered protection. The tank crew felt the weight differently. Inside the steel hull, heat and exhaust mingled with the smell of oil and sweat. Visibility was limited to narrow slits and periscopes smeared with grime. Orders arrived filtered through static, often incomplete, demanding initiative while denying context. The commander balanced aggression against the knowledge that German gunners waited for mistakes. Every meter forward risked exposing the thinner armor. Every pause risked allowing the enemy to adjust aim. As pressure built, the environment asserted itself. The ground was soft from recent rain, tracks slipping as the tank adjusted position. Infantry moved in its wake, boots sinking, hands numb, eyes fixed on hedgerows that might hide a muzzle flash. German fire remained disciplined. It came not in waves, but in corrections, probing shots that tested reactions. When the Americans shifted, the fire followed, calm and methodical. Psychologically, the imbalance deepened. German defenders trusted their system and each other. Americans trusted momentum that rarely materialized. Courage existed on both sides, but it expressed itself differently. Here, bravery was measured in persistence rather than advance. Men stayed in place when instinct urged retreat, kept weapons trained when arms trembled, passed messages forward despite the knowledge that movement drew fire. The tank's gun fired sparingly. Each round mattered, not for spectacle but suppression, a way to pin down unseen positions long enough for infantry to breathe. The blast reverberated through bodies as much as air, a reminder of scale. Yet even this power felt constrained, hemmed in by terrain and doctrine, by the simple fact that steel alone could not solve the problem of ground held by men who expected to die where they stood. By the end of the day, nothing dramatic marked the line's status. There was no breakthrough, no collapse. What changed was subtler. Assumptions on both sides adjusted. Germans noted the tank's stubborn presence and recalculated ranges. Americans learned the cost of every movement and the value of holding, however precariously. Pressure did not release. It redistributed, settling deeper into muscle and mind. The line remained, but was no longer abstract. It was lived, endured, and understood as a narrow space where necessity replaced choice. As evening approached, fatigue became the dominant sensation, eclipsing fear. Hands shook not from terror but exhaustion, and voices dropped to hoarse murmurs. The tank idled less now, conserving fuel, its crew listening for changes in the pattern of fire. Infantry rotated positions when possible, learning names, sharing canteens, forming fragile trust. German flares occasionally rose, washing the field in pale light, revealing nothing new but confirming distance and intent. Both sides used a lull to repair what could be repaired and to accept what could not. Doctrine and improvisation met in that shared understanding. No one expected relief or resolution. They prepared instead for continuity, for another stretch of hours measured not by advance, but by endurance, knowing that the line, once felt, could not be unfelt. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and alert, interrupted by distant impacts and whispered checks. Each man anchored his position by duty rather than hope, waiting without expectation. Simply present as night settled fully around morning arrived without ceremony, a thin gray light sliding across ground already scarred by footprints and shell marks, revealing how little had changed overnight and how much effort it would take to keep it that way. Men stirred stiffly, joints protesting as they checked weapons and positions, eyes adjusting the distance while listening for the first deliberate shots that signaled the day's intentions. The air smelled of damp soil and spent powder, and even before orders filtered forward, everyone sensed that space had shrunk and choices with it. Nothing dramatic announced the tightening, only the accumulation of small losses that could no longer be absorbed. The setbacks came quietly. A forward observation post pulled back after losing its radio. A squad meant to anchor a shallow rise found the ground too exposed under German sightlines and folded into a ditch instead. Each adjustment shortened the line, compressing men into fewer positions, increasing fatigue and confusion. Terrain asserted itself relentlessly. Mud clung to boots and tracks, slowing movement and forcing predictable paths. Hedgerows that once promised cover now framed killing zones already mapped by defenders who had studied this land long before the Americans arrived. German reactions remained measured. When Americans shifted, machine gun fire adjusted in controlled arcs, never wasting ammunition, never revealing more than necessary. Mortars fell with mathematical patience, walking across likely assembly points, then stopping once a message was delivered. There was no sense of urgency in the pattern, only confidence. Doctrine guided every response, and doctrine had been working. From their perspective, the line did not bend. It merely absorbed pressure and redistributed it back outward. For the Americans, maneuver became an exercise in denial. Routes marked on maps were blocked by shelling or observation. Attempt to probe laterally drew immediate fire, confirming that unseen eyes followed every move. Commanders spoke in shorter sentences now, their language stripped of ambition. Hold here, got long. Supporting elements thinned as the day wore on. Infantry units rotated back to resupply or regroup, leaving fewer rifles near the tank. Each departure increased the crew's exposure. Without nearby eyes, the world narrowed to what could be seen through glass and steel. German anti-tank teams were a persistent thought, not yet visible but always possible. Their presence inferred from silence as much as sound. The emotional weight shifted from uncertainty toward sustained tension, a pressure that did not spike but never released. Weather compounded everything. A light rain began to fall, barely noticeable at first, then enough to slick surfaces and dull sound. Visibility dropped, flattening depth perception. Orders had to be repeated, voices raised, increasing the risk of being heard. The tank's tracks struggled in the softening ground, forcing slower, more deliberate movements. Each reposition required calculation, balancing the need to support infantry against the danger of exposing flanks. Despite the confinement, moments of human connection persisted. An infantryman leaned against the tank's hull, sharing a cigarette with the commander through an open hatch, smoke mixing with exhaust. Brief exchanges of names and hometowns grounded men who otherwise existed only as silhouettes. These fragments mattered, small assertions of normalcy against the grinding impersonality of the fight. They did not change the situation, but they made it bearable. German fire tested the limits without crossing them. A shell landed close enough to rock the tank, dirt clattering against armor, then nothing followed. The message was clear. They were seen and they were contained. American return fire was careful, conserving ammunition, aimed more to deny than to destroy. The ground between the lines became a space of mutual acknowledgement, each side aware of the other's presence and constraints. As evening approached, the sense of operational confinement settled fully. There would be no broad movement today, no sweeping action to redefine the fight. The tank remained, essential and vulnerable, its crew alert to every sound, every vibration. Infantry held what they could, digging deeper, reinforcing shallow cover. German positions stayed intact, their confidence unshaken. The situation tightened not through collapse but through endurance, a gradual narrowing that demanded constant attention and exacted a steady toll. By nightfall, everyone understood the shape of the fight more clearly, not because it had changed, but because there was no longer room to misunderstand it. The break did not announce itself with a surge or a shout. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, out of morning shaped by haze and uneven light. Smoke from distant fires drifted low, flattening the terrain into indistinct layers that blurred range and intention. German positions remained where they had always been, but their certainty no longer felt absolute. Pressure elsewhere along the front had drawn attention. Redistributed fire created small gaps in awareness that were invisible on maps but tangible to men watching closely. The tank crew sensed it first, not as opportunity but as a subtle loosening, a change in the rhythm of incoming rounds and the timing of responses. Orders filtered down with caution, framed as contingencies rather than commands. The tank was to edge forward, just enough to test, just enough to see if resistance stiffened or shifted. Committing beyond its original scope was not framed as a gamble, but a necessity born of narrowing options. Infantry adjusted around it, fewer in number now, moving with practice economy, using the tank's bulk as moving cover. Visibility favored no one fully, but it dulled German observation more than American intent. As the tank advanced, its engine note deepened, tracks biting into ground churned soft by days of rain and shelling. The first German response came late and slightly off, machine gun fire skimming wide, corrected too slowly. It was not failure so much as friction, the product of assumptions strained by simultaneous demands. Defensive coherence relies on timing as much as firepower, and here timing slipped. The tank fired deliberately, not at known positions but likely ones, forcing heads down, buying seconds that accumulated into space. Inside the hull, tension sharpened into focus. The commander weighed each meter against the risk of isolation. There were no reserves waiting to exploit success, only the momentum generated by persistence. German anti-tank fire was expected at any moment, yet when it came, it was hurried, a round striking earth instead of armor, revealing the gun's position to infantry already moving on instinct. The breach began not with destruction but confusion. Orders shouted twice, then contradicted. Lines of communication stretched thin. German expectations collided with something they had not fully accounted for. Refusal to stop. American aggression here was not overwhelming but sustained, a steady application of pressure where doctrine anticipated pause. The tank pushed into ground previously denied, its presence forcing rapid recalculation. Defensive teams redeployed, overlapping fields of fire unraveling, as units adjusted independently. Smoke thickened, masking movement and sound, eroding the clarity on which the defense depended. The breach was uneven. One position held stubbornly, exacting cost, while another fell quiet, its crew displaced or cut off. Infantry followed the tank as best they could, moving through churned soil and splintered wood. Senses narrowed to immediate threats. There was no clean line to cross, only a gradual realization that the geometry of the fight had changed. German fire lost its earlier precision, becoming reactive, scattered. Miscommunication compounded the erosion. German runners moved under fire, messages arriving late or incomplete. American radios, unreliable as ever, nevertheless carried enough intent to maintain direction. The tank halted briefly to engage a suspected anti-tank gun, then move again, exploiting hesitation rather than waiting for confirmation. Each small success fed the next, not as momentum but as reduced resistance. Emotionally, the shift registered as disbelief before relief. Men advanced expecting correction that did not come, bracing for the familiar snap of fire that marked the edge of safety. When it failed to appear, movement continued, cautious but persistent. The tank's armor bore fresh scars, shallow dents, and scraped paint. Physical records of near misses that underscored how narrow the opening remained. German defensive coherence did not collapse. It frayed. Units continued to fight, but without the seamless integration that had defined earlier engagements. Some positions held. Others withdrew to secondary lines, creating uneven pressure that the Americans exploited by default. The breach widened not through speed but accumulation, each decision made under stress, contributing to a gradual unraveling. By afternoon, the line as it had been understood no longer existed. It had been reshaped into irregular pockets of resistance and advance. The tank, low on fuel and ammunition, finally paused, its role fulfilled not by heroics but by endurance. Infantry consolidated around new ground, digging in as reflexively as they had before, aware that gains were provisional. German fire continued, but its tone had changed, probing rather than controlling. There was no celebration. Exhaustion replaced adrenaline, and the cost became visible in the wounded being moved back, in the quiet absence of those who did not follow. The break was acknowledged in subdued exchanges, in glances that recognized shared survival rather than victory. As evening settled, both sides adjusted to a new reality shaped by persistence over perfection. The line had broken not in a single moment, but through the slow erosion of certainty, leaving behind a battlefield altered by timing, pressure, and a decision to continue when stopping would have been easier. The ground beyond the broken line felt unfamiliar, not because it was new, but because it had been paid for. Smoke drifted unevenly, and the smell of churned earth mixed with cordite and fuel. Men moved forward cautiously, carrying exhaustion like equipment, aware that every step rested on decisions already made, and no one pretended otherwise now at all. German reactions came quickly but without unity. Small arms fire flared, then paused, then returned from new angles as officers struggled to rebuild coherence. Orders were relayed through noise and smoke, losing precision along the way. Defensive confidence shifted into professional caution, shaped by the need to stop collapse rather than enforce control across scattered positions under fire constantly. American units advanced in short bounds, pausing often, eyes scanning hedgerows and ruined structures. There was no sense of triumph, only responsibility to hold what had been taken. Medics worked close to front, their movements calm and practiced, reminding everyone that progress carried immediate cost measured in blood and shock under constant observation from nearby German elements still. The tank now sat less forward, its presence reassuring rather than aggressive. Crewmen listened for changes in fire patterns, aware that their survival depended on restraint as much as courage. Armor plates bore fresh scars, and every vibration carried meaning. The machine had become an anchor, stabilizing ground that resisted certainty amid shifting lines and uncertain support nearby alone. German countermeasures took form methodically. Secondary positions were activated, weapons repositioned, and overlapping fire rebuilt piece by piece. There was urgency, but remained disciplined, driven by training rather than panic. The aim was no longer dominance but containment, preventing further erosion while buying time to reestablish balance along the sector under mounting strain and limited visibility conditions overall. Weather shifted again, light rain returning and turning dust into paste. Sounds softened, distances collapsed, and commands required repetition. Boots sank deeper with every step, pulling strength from already tired legs. The battlefield felt heavier, as if the land itself demanded payment for movement. Fatigue settled in layers, physical first, then emotional without relief or immediate reassurance anywhere present. American command worked to impose structure on uneven gains. Boundaries were redrawn, units reassigned, and priorities simplified to holding and surviving. Communication improved only marginally, but enough to prevent isolation. Officers moved forward, exposing themselves to share clarity face to face. Leadership became visible again, not in speeches, but in proximity and steadiness during sustained fire and confusion nearby. For the tank crew, waiting replaced advance. Fuel was checked repeatedly, ammunition counted, damage assessed by touch and sound. Every nearby explosion prompted calculation rather than reaction. They understood their role had changed, from forcing openings to preventing reversal. Survival now meant endurance, holding ground long enough for fragile lines to thicken behind them under constant threat of detection. German soldiers adjusted to the new reality with professionalism. Withdrawal from exposed pockets was conducted under covering fire. Casualties moved when possible, weapons saved when not. There was frustration, but also acceptance that assumptions had been challenged. The enemy had not behaved as predicted, and doctrine alone could not account for persistence under unfavorable conditions observed throughout the disrupted. Casualty lists grew quietly. Names were passed in low voices, written carefully, carried backward with the wounded. Loss was not dramatic here. It was cumulative, a steady subtraction that altered units in subtle ways. Each absence changed how men spoke and moved. Grief was delayed, folded into routine, deferred by necessity and exhaustion as fighting continued without pause nearby. As darkness approached, firing lessened but never ceased entirely. Flares rose intermittently, painting ground in stark light, revealing men frozen in work. Digging resumed, deeper now, more deliberate. Both sides prepared for holding rather than advancing. The day's events settled into understanding, a recognition that progress carried consequence and demanded endurance beyond expectation from everyone still standing nearby there. Assumptions, once comfortable, now felt dangerous. Both armies confronted the limits of expectation, learning that lines were not permanent and strength was situational. The tank remained, engine quiet, metal cooling, a witness to change rather than driver of it. Around it, men slept lightly, alert even in rest, carrying forward lessons paid for dearly under stars obscured by smoke. Night sounds replaced daylight violence. Distant engines, coughing wounded, tools striking earth rhythmically filled the air. No one spoke of victory. The ground held was simply ground held, meaningful only because it prevented loss. Officers wrote reports by feel, recording positions that would be revised again, aware that clarity was temporary and fragile within the wider shifting battlefield context. On the German side, reassessment continued through the night. New boundaries were discussed, reserves considered, risks weighed carefully. The breach had altered calculations, but not resolve. Defensive thinking adapted, focusing on denial and delay rather than restoration. The enemy was now respected for persistence, not dismissed for inexperience, a subtle but important shift in attitude across engaged formations overall. American soldiers felt the cost more personally. Letters were started then stopped, words hard to find. Some stared into darkness, replaying moments. Others slept immediately, bodies overriding thought. Shared silence became common, a sign of mutual understanding. They knew assumptions about ease and certainty had been stripped away, replaced by respect for survival's demands earned through continuous exposure there. The battlefield rested uneasily. Neither side claimed resolution, only adjustment. The tank remained intact, its future uncertain, its present essential. Around it, men prepared for continuation rather than conclusion. What followed would build on what had been learned here, under fire and fatigue, where assumptions met reality and consequences were measured quietly by those who endured together without illusion. The fight receded into memory unevenly, not as a single event, but as a series of impressions that lingered in different ways for those who had endured it. For German command, reports arrived trimmed of emotion, focused on timing, coordination, and deviation from expectation. Maps were revised, symbols adjusted, and assumptions quietly questioned. The Americans had not broken through by mass or brilliance, but by refusing to disengage when logic suggested they should. That refusal demanded explanation, and explanation required recalibration. Across headquarters tables, German officers reconsidered earlier judgments. The enemy was no longer framed solely as inexperienced or overly dependent on machinery. Persistence had altered the equation. Defensive doctrine remained sound, but had been stressed by an opponent willing to absorb friction without collapse. The engagement became a case study, not a failure, but a warning. It suggested that American units, when pressed, could adapt faster than anticipated, and that underestimation carried its own risk. For the Americans, there was no strategic reflection yet, only physical recovery and quiet accounting. Weapons were cleaned, damaged equipment tagged, and positions reinforced with the same care that had defined earlier defense. No one spoke of achievement. The ground held felt provisional, its value measured only in how long it could be kept. Experience settled heavily, altering posture and tone. Men who had arrived with questions now carried answers they had not sought. The tank stood among them as a reference point, no longer central, but still present. Its role was discussed in practical terms: ammunition expenditure, fuel usage, mechanical strain. There was no mythology attached to it, no elevation beyond function. It had done what was required when required, nothing more. In the broader campaign, it would be a footnote, one machine among thousands, yet for those who fought beside it, it represented a thin margin between containment and collapse. As days passed, the engagement was contextualized within movements elsewhere along the front. Advances and withdrawals shifted attention, and this sector became one of many shaping the campaign's rhythm. German forces adjusted deployments, spreading experienced units more carefully, while American command absorbed lessons about coordination and endurance. Neither side claimed decisive change, but both altered behavior subtly, informed by what persistence had revealed. Emotionally, the Americans processed the experience without ceremony. Letters home were written more cautiously, omitting detail, focusing on continuity rather than drama. Some men spoke openly about fear and fatigue. Others kept silence. Shared understanding replaced bravado. The idea of the enemy transformed from abstract to personal, no longer caricatured but respected for competence and resolve. That respect carried weight, grounding expectations in reality. German soldiers underwent a similar shift. Confidence remained, but it was tempered. Training emphasized flexibility, communication under pressure, and the danger of assuming collapse where there was only pause. The Americans were now factored into calculations as capable adversaries, not merely obstacles. This recalibration did not diminish resolve. It sharpened it, aligning preparation with observed behavior rather than inherited belief. Within the wider war, such adjustments accumulated. Campaigns were not shaped solely by grand offensives, but by countless moments where expectation met resistance. The engagement faded from immediate concern, replaced by new orders and new pressures. Yet its influence persisted in how decisions were framed. Timing, persistence, and pressure emerged as constants, more reliable than spectacle or overwhelming force. The men who had held the line carried forward a changed sense of self. Survival had stripped away illusion, leaving clarity about limits and capacity. They understood now that endurance was as decisive as movement, that holding under strain could matter as much as advancing. The experience did not make them heroes in their own eyes. It made them cautious, deliberate, and aware of cost. As the front shifted and attention moved on, the tank was eventually replaced, serviced, or redeployed, its story absorbed into maintenance logs and operational summaries. Its presence during that narrow window remained significant only in context, illustrating how individual elements could influence outcomes without defining them. War continued, indifferent to singular moments, shaped instead by accumulation. In retrospect, the engagement stood as an example rather than an exception. Underestimated forces had reshaped the local outcome not through brilliance but through refusal to disengage. German command acknowledged this quietly. American units internalized it without celebration. Belief adjusted on both sides, aligning closer to reality. The recalibration did not end the war or define the campaign, but altered understanding, and understanding influenced survival. The ground where it happened returned to stillness eventually, marked only by scars that would fade unevenly. For those who had been there, memory preserved what terrain could not. They moved on carrying lessons learned under pressure, lessons that would surface again when expectations faltered. In that way, the engagement lived beyond itself, one moment in a larger war where persistence, timing, and pressure reshaped belief without spectacle or claim.